Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, December 27th, 2023, and today we're going to be taking a look at a 2024 presidential election prediction between Governor Gretchen Whitmer from the state of Michigan and former President Donald Trump. Now, historically, I've done a bunch of videos in hypothetical situations about replacement candidates on both sides of the aisle for the 2024 presidential election. I did so back in 2020, and I even did some hypotheticals back in 2016 and elections prior to. And I've noticed that over the past year, I haven't really made that many videos discussing hypothetical situations, and I really enjoy these weird one-off scenarios in which we have different nominees on the top of the ticket, or in some cases, a different Democrat or different Republican. And I actually think this video is going to be quite exciting and something that we find to be a little bit different from our traditional pace and discussion about relevant news and current topics. Now, this 2024 election prediction is obviously not fueled by any speculation that Gretchen Whitmer will be replacing President Biden at the top of the ticket. President Biden is very much going to be the Democratic nominee, and Governor Gretchen Whitmer has already established herself as the co-chair of Biden's 2024 election. But that isn't to ignore the fact that Gretchen Whitmer is making a national name for herself. This election prediction might not be in vain, especially if President Trump loses the 2024 election and decides to have one more go about it in 2028. Gretchen Whitmer launched a new super PAC supporting Democrats in the 2024 election, and it's no secret as to why that might be. These are the very early stances and positions that people take right before announcing a presidential election, just years in advance. Secretary Clinton did it back in 2013 when she left the White House. You also found it to be the case with President Obama and many other Democrats and Republicans who ran in 2016 and 2020. Many of them wanted to get very early on involved with the mainstream politics of it all, with national politics, especially as they came from governorships, Senate elections, representative elections, and also, of course, different localized positions that could serve to be pretty important and make a name for themselves going into the next election. And that's exactly what Gretchen Whitmer is doing. But humor us for a moment to take a look at this 2024 election prediction between Governor Gretchen Whitmer and President Donald Trump. To give you a bit of background context, too, about Gretchen Whitmer as a candidate, in 2022, she won her race against Tudor Dixon, the Republican nominee, by a margin of around 11 points. For context, Michigan went to President Biden by a margin of 2.8%, so this is quite a substantial improvement. It also was an improvement from her 2018 election showing, a year in which Democrats won back control of the House of Representatives and had numerous pickups all across the country when it came down to the governor elections, including the state of Michigan, in which you found that the Democratic Party was able to win here 53.3% to 43.7%. It was a Democratic flip in favor of Gretchen Whitmer. It was a 10-point victory, and one that many Democrats were hoping would come to fruition, but did not expect this margin to be as expansive. And so what we know, too, is that Gretchen Whitmer, quite frankly, is popular. Voters in Michigan like her, and they like her more than they do President Biden, including those who simply say, I didn't vote for her, but I still like her. And those are numbers that you tell us, that show us that Gretchen Whitmer is well positioned, even for an election like this one, where maybe if President Biden wasn't running for re-election and she was the nominee, she probably would be in a better position than President Biden is today. That's largely because, as governor, you don't receive the same national level scrutiny, and you don't have as many people to turn to and say that you are my constituents and I need to actively serve you while running in this election. That's always an issue that the incumbent presidents always have. There's a reason why President Trump was largely blamed for everything and anything that went wrong during his presidency, and the main reason why President Biden and every president prior to is also blamed for that as well. So Gretchen Whitmer has that benefit, and it also helps her that she comes from a swing state. So we'll start off by characterizing all the states that we generally know how they're going to go. Safe blue states, safe red states. These are ones we really don't take much time to talk about, simply because no matter what scenario, no matter who the nominees are, they're going to vote the same way. And so for me, that matters because we characterize all these, and it actually gives us a more narrowed in field about what actually is competitive. That helps us save time and understand the electorate from a different lens. Now, if you're new to election predictions like this one, we also spend time talking about states that we call likely states. Those are states where you would expect them to go practically a year out in either side of the aisle, and generally can determine which party is going to win them. But at the end of the day, the margins are narrow enough that in some type of fluke or even wave year, you could see them potentially flipping to the opposite side of the aisle. For instance, a state that was likely in 2020 that voted for President Biden are states like New Mexico and Colorado that have voted for Republicans in the 21st century, but President Trump simply lost those states. You also found on the Republican side that some likely red states included states like Iowa and Ohio, which as recently as around 10 years ago, Democrats won those states on the presidential margin in 2012, but went to President Trump in both 2016 and 2020. Likely red states, but not entirely lost for Democrats. Contrary to every single state that we've characterized as safe so far, has voted the same way in the 21st century, has not wavered in its support for either side of the aisle in the 21st century. So these states are practically as locked and loaded as you can get for either side of the political spectrum. And that's why we actually narrow down to roughly around 232 electoral votes that are truly in this toss-up column. So around 181 already allocated for Gretchen Whitmer, 125 allocated for Donald Trump, and that reduces us down to these states. But like I said, there are likely states that we generally know how they're going to go, and given this hypothetical circumstance, if the election was held today, I have a general idea of how they would go as well. That means states like Maine, which might not necessarily be safe by margin, meaning 15 points or more, are still very much going to go blue, and I still characterize it as likely blue. Now, Gretchen Whitmer combats a lot of the issues and the problems that President Biden faces being back on the ballot. The issues of his age, the issues of his handling of things in terms of foreign and domestic issues, whether that's healthcare, the war in the Middle East, general topics of conversation around gun control and abortion and protection of American rights, voting rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot that President Biden has had to tackle and a lot that he has, in many people's eyes, not done as effectively, or in some cases tried to do, like canceling student loan debt, but was overturned by the United States Supreme Court. And so in many instances, we find that President Biden, although very much has set out these accomplishments and he's running on these accomplishments, things like infrastructure, CHIPS Act, COVID, whatever it might be, he still finds that a lot of people are pointing out things that he did not do. Gretchen Whitmer, thankfully for her, because she comes into this with a clearer slate, comes from a state where she is highly regarded. Also comes in from a swing state and a singular state. Rather than being president, she comes in as this governor who has ushered in many people's eyes, a positive view of the state of Michigan, and that also is an electable point that she won in 2022 and 2018 and goes into 2024 with that. So she benefits actually from not being an incumbent. The difference here between Trump and Biden is that both of these candidates, for the first time really since Grover Cleveland, have two candidates been able to face up against each other by having track records as president of the United States facing off at the national level, which means both of their track records as governing presidents for the entire country will be laid out and entirely dissected and entirely discussed, and it serves to the detriment of both of them for any of their failures and, of course, to the benefit for any of their successes. Gretchen Whitmer can localize that. She can keep it to the state of Michigan and promise a lot more. And I think with that, it allows her to walk back traditional Democratic voters like Virginia, like New Hampshire, like Colorado, New Mexico, I meant states, not voters, and win them back over into the Democratic column and keep them from being, wavering towards the GOP. I also think she does uniquely well in appealing to white suburban voters. We actually saw that happen in Michigan's governor's race. If we want to compare her performance in some of these states, in Wayne County in 2018, she got about 70% of the vote. In 2022, she got around 71%. And so you're thinking, okay, a 1% increase doesn't exactly account for doing significantly better in a 2022 midterm. But you look across the country, you look across the state, and you see that she did better in some other counties. Benzie County, she wins by 5. Grand Traverse County, she wins by 6. In 2018, she lost those counties. 2 points, 5 points, although very narrow, still lost them regardless. Look around the Grand Rapids area, you see that she has done, historically speaking, a little bit better than she had in years past, 53 to 45, 54 to 44. Looking at that back then, what was it, a 4-point margin? What was it then? A 10-point margin still, but still an improvement for Gretchen Whitmer. And across the state, too, around the center part of the state, yes, winning a lot of the same counties, but the margins were improved upon, specifically in areas that, surprisingly enough for a Democrat, were actually did not have as high of a minority population as some of the other counties, which is unexpected for a Democrat. But the point takeaway from here is that although Whitmer didn't do as well amongst minority voters in 2022 as she did in 2018, she was actually able to expand her margin. And that's because, again, she is uniquely equipped at appealing to white suburbanite voters that actually comprise a significant chunk of the electorate. Not to mention, although she did lose some support amongst minority voters, she still won minority voters by an overwhelming margin and polled and performed higher than where President Biden is today. And so knowing that, too, I would also say states like Minnesota become likely blue. Her home state of Michigan absolutely becomes likely blue. It is very unrealistic to see that Gretchen Whitmer would lose her own home state on the national level, especially after such a strong performance and a significant overperformance in contrary to President Biden. And so Michigan goes blue, Minnesota goes blue. Now Gretchen Whitmer is already at 241 electoral votes. Now let's get centered back to more of a reality-based prediction where we characterize the states that Donald Trump is also going to win. I think that Gretchen Whitmer could certainly give Donald Trump a run for his money in states like Ohio, but not enough that he loses the state, number one, or even wins the state by less than 5 points. I think Ohio is still a red state. Take a candidate like Tim Ryan, who's very strong. He couldn't even come around and defeat J.D. Vance, despite Democrats, quite frankly, having a lot more enthusiasm, energy, money, etc. on their side because of Dobbs v. Jackson, and Ohio a year later overwhelmingly voting in favor of a pro-choice initiative. You find that voters there still very much backed the extremist Make America Great Again candidate. J.D. Vance was a weaker candidate than Donald Trump. He was a weaker candidate than Josh Mandel. He was a weaker candidate than many of the other candidates that had come before him and lost in that state. And yet he won, not narrowly, but by 6 points, because it is a Trump state and because he does quite well. I could see and be swayed into the argument that Ohio would be narrower. I don't think Gretchen Whitmer really is going to narrow down a state that is so partisan and lopsided in favor of the GOP, even if she is from the Midwestern region. Iowa, too, I would characterize as a likely red state for all the aforementioned reasons. So that brings Donald Trump back up to around 148. Now, I am a bit iffy about Florida. We'll talk about that one. I don't know if likely is the best characterization for it. It still very much reverts to being, and we have no proof otherwise to this point, that it does revert being a swing state, especially on the presidential level, and Donald Trump is no Ron DeSantis. I think that is where we will see some more consideration again around that state about what we should characterize it as. Texas, too. I don't know if I'm swayed that Texas is going to be this likely red state pretty solidly. I do think that Donald Trump will win Texas, especially against Gretchen Whitmer. I don't think she exactly has this awe-inspiring appeal to minority voters in Texas, especially Hispanic and Latino voters. But at the same time, she's still a traditional Democrat who wins over traditional Democratic bases, and Donald Trump only won the state by 5.6%. And so I do think Gretchen Whitmer could narrow it down to being a lean state for President Trump. Still a victory, 40 electoral votes in favor of the GOP, but especially as we now start to see that the minority population are growing. In fact, for the first time today, the U.S. Census just declared that minority voters in Texas are larger than non-Hispanic white voters in Texas. That's a big, big thing, and we'll talk about that in tomorrow's video. But Texas is going to be a state that certainly is a change maker for Democrats, and there is a pathway forward to Democratic victories, and it relies on minority voters, and we actually are seeing that the minority population is shaping up to being very beneficial for the National Democratic Party. So Texas right now, lean red. I would also say Florida, probably also lean red. Again, Whitmer's not exactly going to be this awe-inspiring candidate for Hispanic and Latino voters, but I think she could certainly win them, and I think you will find that there is enough minority support there to keep Democrats in a good position for 2024. I think that Gretchen Whitmer would still lose Maine 2nd District, still a Trump district. I think it would narrow up, especially as Whitmer does make improvements amongst white voters, but in that same vein, she improves enough on them that she wins states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Honestly, I could see states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania being likely blue, but the current state of the race nationally, the current state of Donald Trump's numbers are that he still is able to give her a more competitive race in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, but he can't crack Michigan in the way that many of the Republicans against Joe Biden might be able to. And so Wisconsin, Pennsylvania put her over the top. She wins this election, 270 electoral votes. I do think presently today she is a more electable candidate for Democrats than Joe Biden. That isn't to say that she's going to run. I don't think she will, and I don't think she will replace him on the ballot. There are plenty of candidates too that are more electable than Donald Trump as well, that simply are never going to make it to the end of the ballot or even on the ballot in the first place. People who haven't even decided to run for president and certainly won't, as the Iowa caucus is, 2 weeks away at this point? So Gretchen Whitmer could beat Donald Trump, but the question is now, where does the margin get ran up by? Well, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada are states that Joe Biden won. I don't see Democrats losing them. I think these are states where Democrats could reasonably win in Arizona by a lean margin, reasonably win in Georgia by a lean margin as well, and reasonably win in Nevada also by a lean margins. Donald Trump's improvements are largely and solely against Joe Biden and not against other Democrats. And I get we don't have a lot of polling data that shows Gretchen Whitmer in this super strong position for 2024, but what we know from electoral history, from her approval polls, from what we have seen in years past, where you have candidates come out of the fray as very popular swing state governors, senators, and make it to the end of the ballot, or even coming from safe blue states, people like Obama, right? People who are able to win in these areas, even Joe Biden came into this as a popular vice president who ended up with a more favorable view of him on election day than President Trump. In fact, a net positive that was able to sway voters like voters in Georgia and Arizona with the backing of an institutional support group for minority voters, President Obama, Kamala Harris, even Warnock in Georgia turning out minority voters there as well, you found that Democrats were able to capitalize on that and win. Arizona has an abortion referendum on the ballot. Nevada actually very well might have one in 2024. Georgia is a state where if Democrats can tap into minority voters and they nominate a candidate who could be popular enough amongst minority voters, which Gretchen Whitmer very well could be, they win Georgia. And so you move over to the state of North Carolina, I think simply because Donald Trump is about to undergo a lot of criminal investigations and proceedings and court issues, that I do think that Gretchen Whitmer could win the state of North Carolina. I do think that it could be closer than maybe I'm suggesting. Maybe even closer than less than 1 point, right? Narrowed down to a margin similar to what Obama won it by in 2008, 14,000 votes out of millions cast. But I do think North Carolina could go Democrat in 2024 if Gretchen Whitmer is the nominee. Like I've been saying constantly, I do believe she is amongst the strongest potential candidates for 2024 and in a potential matchup against President Trump. Although this map looks very reminiscent to ones that we have seen in Trump v. Biden rematches maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, when Biden was riding a lot higher than he is today. That's because our electoral maps are boring. That's because our electoral process is not nearly as fun or as toss-up-y as it should be. A lot of these states are safe. We remember that over half the map was already decided before this election had even begun. So we're working under that. We're working under a point where these margins actually tell a much bigger story than what the actual numbers do, which is why we spend so much time deciding and defining and defending the reasons for some of these characterizations. And so in the event, in some hypothetical world that Gretchen Whitmer is the nominee against Donald Trump, I do believe she beats him 319 to 219, and this also suggests that in 2028, she could also be a very formidable Democrat going into that election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already. Check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.